Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm just going to give people a minute or so to filter into the webinar and we'll get started. Okay, welcome. Thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Will Snell. I'm the Chief Executive of the Fairness Foundation, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's event in partnership with the Policy Institute at King's College London as part of our Fair Society event series. And previous events in this series have featured a range of leading thinkers from Liam Byrne and Sam Friedman to Will Hutton, Minouche Shafiq, Kate Pickett, Richard Wilkinson, Peter Turchin, Ingrid Robbins, Elizabeth Anderson, and others. And today we're delighted to welcome Professor Danny Dorling to talk about his fascinating new book, Seven Children, Inequality and Britain's Next Generation. Danny is the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford and the author of more than a dozen books and hundreds of journal papers on issues related to social inequalities in Britain. And in Seven Children, he constructs seven children from different income brackets to explore what increasing levels of poverty and inequality mean for the life chances of this generation of children in the UK. And after hearing from Danny for about 15 minutes, we'll have responses from a brilliant panel. Firstly, Georgia Banjo, Britain correspondent at The Economist, and then Dame Rachel de Souza, the Children's Commissioner for England. And we're delighted to have you both with us, so thank you. And we should have plenty of time for Q&A before we finish at 2 p.m. sharp. So please submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function. Earlier the better, and you can also upvote other people's questions. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Danny.
Thank you ever so much, Will. And thank you, Georgia and Rachel, for joining as well. I'm going to keep to 15 minutes, which means I'm going to share my slides now. And hopefully that has worked. And I'm sure somebody will shout if you can't see them. This is an unusual book. It's unusual because it's about the state of the nation and it's about statistics. But the seven children are described as if they are real. So the book is neither fiction nor non-fiction. Their lives are described, but their lives are based on facts. It took me quite a long time to find a publisher for the book. Three publishers asked if I had permission to tell the stories of these children, and I had to explain that they really didn't exist. That made me more confident, but I don't know if I've done a good story or not. There's a very simple pattern to the children. They're called Anna, Brandon, Candice, David, Emily, Freddie, Gemma. I'm not very imaginative. I know which order they're in because it's alphabetical. The way I decided to create them was to take all 14 million children who were born in 2018 and divide those 14 million into 7 groups by their household income. And at various times in the book, I called them Mondays, Child, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays as well. There's a lot of repetition about the number 7 in the book. Why 7? For those of you who are statistically minded, the UK every March publishes households below average income. This is where our official poverty statistics come from. All the households of the UK are divided into 5 groups, 5 quintiles, equal numbers of people. The bottom quintile, the bottom fifth of households has 2 out of all 7 children. The next fifth has 2 out of 7. 4 out of 7 children in the UK live in the poorest 40% of all houses. Why should this matter? Because our poor houses are very poor. When did this happen? It happened in the 1980s. I'm a child of the 60s. In the 70s, we became one of the most equal countries in Europe. Only Sweden, amongst large countries, was more equal than us. We then had a huge increase in inequality, and we kept it there. Those two lines are flat. That's an inequality distribution measured by the Gini coefficient. I describe it in the book as rather like having high blood pressure and living with it. It is not good. This is what the book is about. The start of this period is it's okay if the rich are rich as long as they pay their taxes. I hope what the book shows is that that's not the case. It doesn't help you. The book doesn't have tables in it. It has a few graphs, but it mostly describes the lives of these children and what they're like and their parents talking to each other about them. I'm not a fiction writer, so I made the children aged 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 because children that age don't tend to say very much. It's easier to write about them. I use statistics to determine what they had and didn't have. So if we take our poorest child, Anna, her family income after tax and benefits is £118 a week. If you take that back 100 years, that's about £1 a week. And if you know your social history of poverty studies, there's a famous book titled Around £1 a Week about what the respectable working class lived on in Lambeth around the time of the First World War. In some ways, some things haven't changed at all. Anna's mum is very thrifty. Anna's dad is not living with them. She says she can decorate a house, but of course that's a subjective question, what decoration is. They can't afford a holiday. She can afford to insure the contents of their house and to save £10 a month. She can't afford to replace furniture when it's worn out. She can't afford to replace electricals, except for her mobile phone, which she has to replace because she can't live without a mobile phone. And she has no money to spend on herself. This is a table of statistics. She can keep the house warm and she says she can pay the bills. I won't go through the other 7 children, but this is trying to give you an idea of how these were constructed. Their characteristics all add up to the national totals that we know from the surveys that are produced. Not just from this, but they have the right number of siblings and as many things as I can do. They don't have an ethnicity and a race, which is obvious because with 7 children, that's too few to show that. And I keep their geography fairly quiet because, again, I'm not interested in stereotyping particular areas. I'm interested in the distribution. Why? This graph isn't in the book, but I like graphs, as you can see. I forced myself to write a story with words because most people really don't like graphs. Most people don't understand graphs. We are an incredibly innumerate country. But why are the 7 children in such a terrible situation? The answer is that the UK is extreme. We have the highest income inequality of all of Europe. It will take Bulgaria. And we're a low tax, low spending economy. That red line is the tax take and the spend of the UK, essentially. And it's at the bottom. Okay. And yes, it's higher than it's been for 70 years. Okay. The spikes are paying for COVID and paying for the banking crash. I could spend an hour with that graph, you would fall asleep, which is why describing the lives of children is much more effective than showing that and making bad jokes. Just explaining in Europe, there are these terrible countries like Belgium and France and Finland and Norway and Denmark, where they tax their population hugely and everybody is falling apart because society doesn't work. Whereas down with us in Portugal and Spain, we're doing well. I mean, I could be trite about it, but I've spent many decades looking at these things. Brandon, the second child. When Brandon was born in 2018, the 19th percentile of individual adults had an annual income before tax of 78,500, almost 80,000. You might remember the man on Newsnight who refused to believe he was in the top 5%, who had an income of 80,000. Now, 85,000 doesn't actually put you in the top 5%. It puts you much higher than that, because this is just the 95th percentile of individuals who are paying tax. Over 40% of all adults don't pay income tax because they don't have enough income, and that includes the parents of quite a lot of children. So even people who think they know about income don't know about income, and it's a shock. The income after housing costs per week is shown in the middle column there. We start with Anna at 118 and we end with Gemma at £984 a week. Sounds like a fortune. Gemma is the middle child of the best of 2 million. £984 a week, that's for Gemma's family, is around about £50,000 a year, or £25,000 for each for her parents after paying tax and getting any benefits, which they don't because they're well off. 6% of all children live in families better off than Gemma's, which I suspect will include the majority of people who buy and read this book. If your income is higher than £25,000 after you paid your taxes, then you're above my richest seventh typical child. That's 6% of children who do better than Gemma. Their families take a third of all the income in Britain every year, and nowhere else in Europe does this happen. We are extremely weird. Here are quotes from Stephanie Flanders last year and the year before about Estonia and John Byrne Murdoch. The poorest fifth of people in the UK are poorer than the average of the poorest fifth in Eastern Europe. Right? We are a poor country, but we don't know what that means unless it is described to us. And we don't feel it, most of us. Most people don't cry at a graph, right? We don't feel it without a story. You can, and this is why instead of producing a table like this, you tell a story that you can have a child like Candice, our third child, whose parents can tick yes to all these things. That Candice has somewhere she can play, that there are enough bedrooms in their house, that they can celebrate a birthday. But what is it to celebrate a birthday when you have hardly anything a week? That somehow they get a bicycle, and I go into how that happens in the book. But they don't need a playgroup. Almost everyone, by the way, can get a warm winter coat, but what parent is going to write that their child can't have a warm winter coat? And what is a warm winter coat? Where do I get these numbers from? Roughly 30 spreadsheets are published every year by the government, containing a dozen sheets within them, which are the statistics. We've been measuring this since 1994. Hardly anybody looks in detail at it anymore. But things do change. Look where Scotland is on this graph. This is the official measure of child poverty, the proportion of children living below 60% of median income. And there's Scotland on 24%, better than the southeast of England, better than where I live in Oxfordshire, better than Surrey. And that wasn't the case when I began work on this in the late 1980s. So you really do get changes. Those percentages might look low, but remember they're relative to the median. We've had the biggest cost of living crisis. Well, at the moment, it's almost the longest since 1788, and it got worse recently. So these are poor compared to an average, which has got 30% off in the last 2 or 3 years. But there's huge variation. There's huge variation in what can happen. There's huge geographical variation as well. Here's a map of London for those who are not aware. You know, living cheek by jowl, parallel lives. Our 7 children tend not to meet. We have a segregated school system in this country, unlike any in the rest of Europe. And it becomes more segregated. And I'm not simply talking about the 7% who go to private schools. By the way, Gemma, her parents agonize about whether they're going to send her to a private school. They could do it, but they'd have no money left at all. Not just talking about private schools, but the differences between state schools, catchment areas, and so on. The pie chart there is showing the amount of money that these families are living off after paying for housing. And that's the differences. Gemma's family, by the way, Gemma's mum and dad run a corner shop quite well. Right, that's our rich kid, number 7. We have more money than numbers 1, 2, and 3 put together. And let's go forward. Some pictures of Scottish cities. You know, we have the same geographical segregation that we had when train spotting was written. We have the same patterns in Glasgow, although Glasgow is no longer as poor relatively to the rest of the UK as it was. In Scotland, children get a special payment if their family receives any form of benefit. That is about 2 out of every 7 children. It's not tapered, you get it anyway. It's 25, well, it's gone up, it's £25 a week. Family of 3, almost £4,000 a year. That means you don't go hungry, you don't go cold. I won't go through this table, but just to say, how do I tell the stories? I tell the stories so they add up to this about can you go to the cinema in your bedrooms? A crucial one, just to give you an idea of and why it's slightly complicated. We have had a slight increase over time in people who say they can save £10 a month. Many, many parents can't save £10 a month, but it's increased. But at exactly the same time as that has increased, the ability to save £10 a month, exactly the same proportion of parents now say they cannot afford to insure their home in case of fire or theft or flooding. So these things move around and different things become normal. Here's probably the most dramatic graph. I'm sorry, it's a bit small. It's the United Nations graph released in December about changes in child poverty in every country in which they compare, which is similar. It's a brilliant news story. All those purple and blue graphs are enormous falls in child poverty, measured mainly in Eastern Europe, but many other areas. Absolutely brilliant. There are a small number of countries where child poverty is increasing. The worst ones are yellow, but that's still a good news story because that's Norway, Switzerland, France, and Iceland, which tend to have quite low child poverty. And then at the top, there is the United Kingdom. Now, somebody has to be at the top of every graph, right? Somebody has to be at the bottom of the class. Somebody has to be doing badly. But you don't have to do as spectacularly badly as that, as already have relatively high child poverty and managed to achieve the biggest increase measured. I mean, and so the book is a bit depressing in places, but it has hope. It is almost impossible statistically for things to get to this state and not then to get better, at least in terms of the gaps between people. That's why we're getting the doom and gloom forecasts and your taxes are going to go up in the autumn because government has no other choice. Benefits have risen in line with inflation because they had to, because otherwise we'd have more than 40% of children in the family of 3 going hungry. Wages at the bottom have gone up faster than wages at the top. We are seeing the first equalisation of our society since the one that began at the time of the First World War. I can give you hope. It's just that at the point at which inequalities finally turn, and when they begin to reduce, everybody feels worse off. If you're a civil servant, you may be pleased to know that the senior civil servants have had a 25% real pay cut since 2008. You know, they haven't done that well if you were a bit of a mean civil servant. And junior civil servants a 12% pay cut. All worse off, all can have less, but the gaps are falling. The red line there just shows you the cost of living crisis. We'd almost got out of it before that famous budget and then that plummeting, but you know, worldwide inflation as well, but it's spectacular. Gemma, the last child. There's some text from the actual book. Gemma will probably grow up thinking she's poor. You may think, oh, that's ridiculous. This is our 7th child. Only 1 million children are better off than Gemma. But remember, Gemma's mum and dad are running a corner shop. They don't both go on holiday with her at the same time because they're running a corner shop. She can grow up saying, I didn't always have holidays. She may go to a private school, in which case she'll be one of the poorest children in that private school. And if she goes to university, which she probably will, she'll meet people much better off than her. And she will think she is poor. And this is the difficulty with Britain at the moment, is that we are so pulled apart, so extreme, that we don't have an idea, apart from the faithful statistics of what is going on. The graph there is showing child heights falling. Scotland, very kindly, although not yet published, have released their data. We always publish BMI data on how fat kids are going, but we don't publish the 2 things that correspond to that, which is weight and height. Other people do. The United Kingdom, 5-year-olds falling since 2010, which matters politically because that began with nutrition beginning to fail in 2005 to 2010. United States is doing badly, which we all know about. Germany did badly for a few years. That's what happens if you let 1.5 million Syrian refugees in, half of whom are children. You get a slight dip. Right. It's complicated, but it's awful. Our children are getting shorter. Their death rates are rising in absolute terms. The hunger levels are rising. The homelessness is rising. Oh, in our politics, a graph from the Financial Times. At one point, those circles are every single country in the rich and middle of the world, and one political party was most extreme economically, according to Financial Times analysis based on political scientists around the world. Somebody has to be extreme. Somebody has to be on the edge, but you normally learn from it. Final couple of graphs. There's the income distribution of the 7 children. Note to the right of Gemma, who's purple, the 6 children out of 100 doing better. Note that the top 2 bars can't fit on the graph. They just go way, way up. If I was being sarcastic, which I can be, then the child of the 2% is the Prime Minister's children. And the child of the 1% is the Prime Minister's children when the Prime Minister isn't in office, can actually earn a lot of money. Positive. That last Gini coefficient graph. Note if you squint that most of those European curves are going downwards. When people and social scientists tell you that inequality is always rising, just remember in most of the world, most of the time, at the moment, it's falling. Even in the UK, it's falling. It's just incredibly high. So there is hope. And there isn't an inexorable division where our children will and their children will forever be pulled apart. And even better, the countries at the bottom, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Germany, and so on, are doing much better in terms of the outcomes. And we do not yet have a country in Europe that has become too equal. We don't yet know what that actually would be like. Here's my last slide, advertising the book. There's a range of people on the back, that's all I'm saying, including people who used to work in Tony Blair's office and so on. And I have a feeling that sentiment is changing. I honestly think that the putting up with this, one more push, a bit more economic growth, and we'll be okay. I think that thinking has ended, and we realise that we're in a situation that in our past, in our great and great-great-grandparents' time, we realised before. And we realise it most easily with children, because nobody blames a child for being lazy. They did not create the situation into which they have been born. Thank you very much for letting me talk for so long.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danny. Lots of questions, but we're going to move on to our panelists and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. So Georgia, over to you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Will. And thank you so much for letting me be here, because I think it's a really, really important topic. And I think this is a really timely and important book. I think when we look at averages, we look globally, don't we? And we see that Britain is the 6th richest country in the world. I think when we look around us, as Danny said, we often see people that are in a similar income bracket to ourselves. And there's always countries that are worse off than us. I mean, Danny obviously couldn't put all the countries on those slides, but I was a correspondent in Brazil for a bit. And there you can really see the inequality. You know, most rich people only meet poor people when they're cleaning for them or acting as their maid. So I think it's good that we're now talking about it more. And I think it's really great that we've got people like Danny drawing attention to the issue. But I still think it hasn't quite sunk in enough that we have the highest income equality in all of Europe, give or take Bulgaria, and that the poorest fifth are poorer than their counterparts in Eastern Europe. These are really quite staggering statistics. And I see a little flavour of that when I go around the country in my job as a journalist. And there are kind of the extreme kinds of poverty, you know, the ones that most often make the headlines, the ones that journalists like me are drawn towards. But then there are also the quieter kinds of poverty and inequality. And one example that sticks with me is recently I went to Bicester in Oxfordshire. You might know it, really great outlet village, lots of Chinese tourists. But there I saw young, outwardly middle-class families who were really struggling after their mortgages went off went up after the Liz Truss budget. The people that can only survive if nothing goes wrong that month, the people that are beginning to go to charities like Citizens Advice or turn to help that they didn't need before. And I think that says a lot about the fact that, yes, these are really kind of now increasingly typical experiences for children in this country, and that everyone's really feeling worse off. But I also think it is important to draw attention to the experiences of people towards the end of that graph that Danny showed us, the ones that are, Mondays or Tuesdays child. And I had another experience recently where I went to a community centre in Northampton, I think it was, not Nottingham. But to kind of try and get a sense actually of a course there where they were explaining to people how to navigate the benefit system and how to claim what they were entitled to. And when I was there, I met a dad who was caring for his autistic son. I met a mother who had a serious mental illness and was being repeatedly denied PIP, which is the main disability benefit. There was a carer there who was looking after her disabled daughter while working part-time, and she'd just been sanctioned because she'd worked a few hours more than she was meant to get the carer's allowance of £81 per week. And all of these people were entitled to these benefits. It was clear that they were meant to be the people who was getting them. But I thought it was interesting that they had to be taught how to navigate this system, which is deliberately designed not to help them. And it seems like the welfare state we have today is not actually about reducing inequalities anymore. It's actually about exacerbating them. So there's lots of things you see in that space, where people are almost incentivized to game the system, to exaggerate your disability so that you can get the benefits you need, to hide extra earnings because your benefits aren't enough to live on, to not work more hours because of a very high taper rate. Then at the same time, we're spending tens of billions a year on housing benefit, which goes mostly to private landlords. And so there's lots of things in the system that don't quite seem to add up. And it does seem like we're doing lots of things backwards. And then just another example that I think about a lot, the subject I mainly cover, which is health. And that's actually how I first met Danny, is covering life expectancy and realizing that if you travel 6 miles within London, life expectancy can fall by 20 years. And as Danny also pointed out, that death rates are rising for children, and that some children are very short and are stunted. And I think all of these things say a lot about our society and what we choose to value. Just as we can see that now with public services falling apart, be it with social care, which I also cover, or with the NHS, that a lot of people now can't get the help they need. And I was in Liverpool earlier this year, and I was visiting a charity which does a lot of work with refugees. And one of the people there said something which, I found quite shocking, which was that they had a lot of resentment from local people, not for the reasons you might expect, but because the charity had organised for a dental bus to come and, extract a few teeth, the refugees. And, some local people were really annoyed because they weren't able to get NHS appointments anymore. Then another place I went to recently, it's good that The Economist pays me to travel, but another place I went recently was Derry in Northern Ireland. And there it was even more shocking. If you imagine the worst waiting list we know about in England, in Northern Ireland, the waiting times are many times worse for treatment. And in the last few years, the number of people paying for private healthcare in Northern Ireland has gone up by, I think, over 200%. And if you think about what's happening there, if you have to wait many years for treatment, you either stump up the money to pay, or you can't do that, and then you go without. So there's the 2-tier system for you, or probably even the 3-tier system at that point. So I think it's really important to think about, what does all this mean if children are growing up in a society which is so divided, where the opportunities already are so stark? And I actually saw a little bit of this myself as a child. In a way, maybe it was a bit of an unusual experience because I went to 2 very different schools in 2 very different parts of the country. One was in a really poor part of Merseyside, where I saw some of the extreme examples of poverty, children who had scabies, who always had nits, who were, really, really difficult family situations. But generally, it was just families that didn't quite have enough. you know, really we're just getting by. And then when I was 10, my parents moved us to Cambridge, where the norm was to have doctors or professors or artists as parents. And so they really would be in the top few percent. And these were kids that I saw had the same amount of intelligence, but ended up on very, very different paths. And I think that's probably a bit of the story that Danny is trying to tell. And then I just want to lastly quickly say something about, you know, the jobs of people like me who report on Britain. We're meant to tell the story of this country. And at the moment, we've kind of been through an interesting time where we think that diversity is having Northern accents in the newsrooms, or it's having people like me, ethnic minorities, who also, you know, may have gone to a private school or had a very privileged education. And of course, that's really important. But I do think that, you know, when we think about poverty and when we think about inequality, I think that we have to be able to tell that the everyday experience of most of our children is very, very different from the people who are sitting in newsrooms. So I think we need a lot more socioeconomic diversity. I think we need to try and tell these stories better. And I think it's great that, you know, we've heard a bit of a message of hope about how things might be changing. But I think, you know, there's clearly a lot more to do. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Georgia. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, and hi everyone, and I'm really delighted to be here today, and thanks for asking me to take part in this panel. And it's so important to hear from Professor Danny Dorling about his forthcoming book, 7 Children, Inequality in Britain's Next Generation. It's absolutely packed, as we saw, with hard-hitting statistics, really highlighting the urgency needed if we want to end child poverty. And what all I could think about when he was talking, I've literally was this summer. I mean, we saw riots on the streets. You know, we're seeing children being in court now and being incarcerated. And so one of the things I did was get myself over to Oslo. I wanted to look at a different model for childhood. We have about 420 children in prison in this country. Oslo has fewer than 10. I went to visit them all. First of all, no child who goes to a police station in Oslo. They go to the barnhouse if they're arrested, and in the barnhouse it's run by police, but there are doctors, dentists, because they think that bad teeth are a sign of child neglect. Psychologists, social workers, sentences. Normally, they don't incarcerate children. They've got fewer than 10 children incarcerated. Sentences are normally things like you'll go to school every day, you'll play football twice a week, you're going to have an adult volunteer mentor who's going to talk to you, and you're going to talk about your life. What a different model. When I talked to the boys in prison, they were like I say, 10 of them, they were like, psychologist comes 3 times a week, we play football with the guards, just completely different. Every service for children I looked at was not one person spoke to me about money, and I realized just how deeply we are in our system and we forget this. Health were leading on safeguarding and multi-agency work. It was stunning. So today's Danny's graphs today make all the sense to me, but the cri de cœur from me has got to be about, and what I heard from everyone, from the chief of police, the people in the hospital, the children themselves, was that childhood matters. We value childhood. It has a value, the quality of childhood is incredibly important. So my team and I often hear from children all over the country about their deep sense of justice, about their ambition for a fair and equal society. No one more than the children want fairness, and fairness for each other. That just comes out so strongly. They were massively concerned about the cost of living. As I went across the country, there wasn't one child talking to them for a big survey that we did, not one child anywhere. When I asked the question, whose parents are concerned about cost of food, every hand went up, and the impact that that's having. Now, in my role as Children's Commissioner for England, I've got a duty and a responsibility to listen to children and promote and protect their rights. And it's my mission that their voices are heard and acted upon by decision makers. And we have a great opportunity now with change of government to make that happen. Now, this was even more important this year when we approached an election. So that's why I launched my Big Ambition survey. I wanted to hear directly from children, young people, parents across the country, and I wanted to hear about their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations for the future. So almost 370,000 children engaged with the survey, meaning that and the previous one I've now heard from 1 million school-aged children in my time as Children's Commissioner. And I'm particularly pleased this included so many children whose voices and views are too often overlooked, because a truly ambitious vision for childhood must have these children at its heart. So in this latest one, I got about 40,000 children with a special educational need, added to the 98,000 I got in my previous survey, almost 14,000 children with a social worker, and every child in the secure estate. We visited all of them. They all filled that in. That means every child in youth prison, and around 300 children in mental health hospitals filled it in. There were responses from every local authority in England, from children of all ages. And as I travelled the length and breadth of England, a few issues came up in every town, village, and city, everywhere. And among these issues, mental health, concerns about mental health, online safety, issues around the online world, physical safety, knife crime, safety on our streets, and cost of living. Look, there was no lack of ambition among our children. They were hugely, everyone, had big dreams and things they wanted to do, but they were bogged down by the problems of adulthood. And it's no surprise to me that children reflect back many of the challenges we see in society today. Many also had real concerns about the unfairness and injustice they see around them, and that came out incredibly strongly. I knew anecdotally that fairness was an issue children cared about passionately. So when my team and I were designing the Big Ambition survey, we wanted to make sure we asked children directly how they felt about fairness. So in the survey, we asked whether they agreed with the statement, "You are treated fairly," or "they are treated fairly," for the adults, the parents who responded on behalf of babies. Overall, 70% of children agreed, with adults responding on behalf of children more likely to agree than when children responded to themselves. But younger children were also more likely to agree. What's interesting is only 55% of 15-year-olds agreed that they're treated fairly. And what we see is a growing sense of injustice that many children feel as they get older. And again, it's not just about themselves, it's about other children too. That came across incredibly strongly. So how do we tackle injustice? Well, we need to talk about justice and equality. We need to talk about the limiting effects of poverty. As children told me in the Big Ambition, they see poverty as a fundamental barrier to fairness and equality. They worry constantly about the cost of living and the impact of rising prices on their family. One girl's quote, we've got 250,000 text responses. One girl stood out saying the government should bring down the cost of living crisis so children are not stressed for their parents. That was a 10-year-old girl. Can't tell you how many 8-year-olds worried about what job they're going to have or worries for their parents. It's an absolute blight on childhood. And this brings me to the impact of inequality on families. Look, I have spent 32 years working in schools, 20 of those as a head teacher, but it's clear to me before I became Children's Commissioner, it's clear to me that if there's one institution, if I may describe it as that, which can have even more of a transformational effect on the child, it's their family and supporting their families. It means everything to them, whatever shape and size, however it looks. But that's why it's so essential families have the resources they need to provide a loving and stable home that supports children to thrive. In my family review, we showed that at least 50% of children born in 2000 didn't live with both parents and actually had to move during their childhood. That's a level of instability that just is not caught in the normal census data and was absolutely fascinating and links to the poverty theme. I was pleased to learn that most children, and our Brit kids are great because they're always so understated, about 86% of them felt their families had what they needed to support them. About 83% of children agreed their family gets to spend quality time together, but that's of 1 million children. And so that means there are large numbers of children who do not feel this is true. And that affects some children more than others. For example, only 73% of children in Hartlepool agreed their family is everything it needs, compared to 86% in Hampshire. 71% of the children with a social worker agreed, compared to 87% for children without a social worker. So the message that came through to me so clearly was that We can't think about what makes a thriving, happy family unit, if you like, without thinking about poverty. And for some families, the strain of poverty is so acute, it eclipses everything else. It's poverty and nothing else that's making family life hard. And that's why we need a plan, and we need to urge the government to really get that plan to ensure that no child grows up in poverty. It would be unthinkable in our Nordic cousins to not try to address that. How can we not be doing it? As one 15-year-old boy put it, end child poverty and ensure all children have the same opportunities. And I couldn't agree more. I'm determined to make sure poverty is no longer a barrier to opportunity with all of you. And when it comes to opportunity, I think we need to think about how we listen or don't listen to children about the issues they care about. We've got an opportunity to see their perspective, to look at solutions differently. We should grab it. One of the findings that's really stood out from the Big Ambition survey was how little children feel we do listen. Do you know, they think politicians are important. They saw politicians close their school. They saw politicians do the vaccine rollout. They are not cynical about politics, but they do not feel listened to. Only 22% of children in our surveys feel they've been listened to by those running this country. That's 1 in 5. Only 1 in 5 children think that their views are taken into account. This is by those in charge. This is deeply concerning, must not go unnoticed, and I'm making my mission to change this. But we should all be galvanised by this finding. You know, what kids say to me is, when Boris held those COVID meetings, did you ever see a child there? Of course we didn't. So we should be making sure children's voices are heard, that they're consulted on the key decisions that affect their lives. Now, in my own work, I've made sure, obviously, as Children's Commissioner, young people are at the table and are very firmly part of the conversation. I take them everywhere with me. I take them into the Home Office to discuss illegal immigration with ministers. I take them everywhere. I drive everyone mad. But ahead of publishing my survey findings, I made sure my 16 youth ambassadors were at every roundtable and launch event. And in this way, we've been able to show them we're taking their views forward. Children can see the world as it could be. They're ambitious, they're aspirational, they're full of hope. They want, even the ones suffering the most, they want fairness, they want equality, and crucially, they want to be listened to about their views. As one boy said, we should all be treated fairly and equally everywhere we are or where we go, boy 11. And I believe it must be our ultimate goal, and to get there, we need to listen, then act on what children think. We should have their voices in our ears and an urgency in our steps, so we can break down the barriers that children face from being able to achieve whatever they set out to. All of us who have a role in improving the lives of children and in tackling inequalities, whether that's direct work with children, policy work in Parliament, or in the media. We've got to commit to taking it seriously and listen to what children are telling us. We want to build a country that's a truly wonderful place for children to grow up. We can't ignore what they're telling us. They're going to inherit the decisions we make. They tell me that all the time. So we should listen, then we should act. I'm going to leave you with the words of one 11-year-old girl. The government should listen to children's ideas more, and children shouldn't have to pass their ideas to an adult to make it happen. Children should be able to change the world too. Of course they should. Of course they must. Of course, let's make it our mission to ensure that they do. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Danny, I'm going to come to you with a couple of questions, if that's okay, before asking some questions of the panel. Firstly, to give you a chance to respond to the comments made by Georgia and Rachel. And secondly, question from me about how you think about wealth inequality as opposed to income inequality in terms of its scale, its importance, its trajectory, its consequences, if that can be done fairly quickly.
Okay, as quick as I can. Georgia, thank you especially for talking about the two schools, because most people who engage in this debate, like us, will know about the school in Cambridge or a school of that type, and not the other. And this is a real issue. Rachel, I'm glad you started off with about going to Oslo, because I first talked about child poverty in Oslo about 30 years ago. And I made the mistake in a town hall in Oslo of beginning my talk by saying, congratulations that Norway has the lowest child poverty rate in the world. And I was booed. The audience were middle class, posher than middle class. There were babies, I can remember that because that was quite uncommon but babies were being held in the audience. They booed me and shouted, "It's too high," which is why the child poverty rate was so low in Norway. So the most crucial opinions here are the opinions of the best off. There have been tweets in my Twitter today of people saying, "Why do we allow poor people to have children?" Some of the nastiest stuff. And the temptation to reply, "I wish they'd never have you," just crossed my mind, but I obviously don't do that. But I agree with listening to children, but most of all, it's we're going to need a change in sentiment amongst the best off. And wealth, on the correlations, it's income and income differences that just fit so closely to outcomes. And interestingly, the Nordic countries, particularly Norway, with its oil wealth, do have some pretty high wealth inequalities. But they have a deal, I think. And the deal essentially is, and it's unspoken, we'll have a good and caring state and we'll have high taxes, but please can you leave my nice little apartment in Oslo alone that's worth $1 million US dollars. This deal works while Europe is relatively rich. As we sink down, I think we're probably going to have wealth taxes, and certainly the UK. You can see it as Keir Starmer begins to sing, things can only get worse in a kind of inverse D-Ream version. The rumours about capital gains tax coming to normal income tax levels, taxes on your second home, VAT on schools is only the beginning. This is not because this Labour government wants to tax the rich. It has no choice but to do so, and it's going to have to do so from wealth taxes as well as income taxes. Simply at the very, very beginning, to pay child benefit in England to the third and fourth child in families. Just as a start, that's non-negotiable. That's the very first thing you do. And we can look at the Nordic countries, and it's great. My favourite is Finland because they've done it all without any oil money. But we can look to Scotland. You know, we have an example within the UK of a nation who's decided that when they're not going to have thousands of children expelled from schools, they're not going to let landlords put up rent so that children are evicted, as in London, on average every 3 years. You know, why are parents splitting up? You try and pay that rent and you'll find it hard to get on, that you will argue, you split up, and then you have to move school and change friends again and again, because when we got rid of the Rent Control Acts in the 1980s, we never intended for over a quarter of all children to be in private rented with no security of tenure, just 2 months. Right? It was never the intention. It was never the intention in the 80s to create this mess. But boy, have we. And you know, there are ways out of it. They're all over Europe, but also within the UK as well.
Great, thanks, Danny. Georgia, can I ask a question for you about language? How can we change the language of the debate in order to change minds where we need to around poverty and inequality and the cost of living?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I have to say, I agree with Danny about, I think actually it's about explaining actually, you know, the state we're in. And I think clearly this book is a start at doing that. But I think often with language, it's very easy, isn't it? You know, and we've done this for hundreds of years, which is to get into kind of rhetoric about the deserving and undeserving. And I think, you know, I think once people start to understand how these things happen, how you can work a full-time job and still not earn enough to keep a family, how, you know, rising costs, as you say, in kind of private rented accommodation mean that you know, all of that money that you would have been able to put into other things is now going to someone else. I think once you start to understand that and how it affects people, that's how it starts to change. But I think it's not so much about you know, kind of precisely how you explain these things. It's more about how you see the other people. And I think we've lost a bit of that in terms of that compassion.
Great, thank you. Rachel, we have the opportunity, so to speak, of the new government's opportunity mission, which, you know, they've made very clear is partly, obviously, well, largely about what you do within the classroom, but also importantly includes what the barriers to opportunity are outside the classroom gates, and with poverty clearly up there. What do you think we can do to make sure that the new government is taking action across all those barriers to opportunity, not just those within the classroom?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a massive question, really, and I think it's good to see the poverty task force. I think it's good. I think one of the places I'm really concerned about is children's services. And support for children, whether that's health, social care, and one of the things I've just done is basically, as children's commissioner, I've got a couple of things I can do that are my kind of statutory powers. One of them is to get data from absolutely any public body without an FOI, needing an FOI, who hold information on children. So I've just put out a school survey to every single school in the country and college, and asked them all the questions about, are you running a food bank? What are the poverty issues in your school? What's your pastoral care? We've asked them about medical issues, please, everything. And I think we don't realise just how fragmented the system has become, that nobody knows the answer to this question. Have you ever tried to answer the question, how many police stations are there in this country? You can't find the answer. So we're actually, I think one of the things we can do is get really fantastic and compelling data to keep encouraging the solutions from government, because really, a lot of the questions we've asked, people just don't know the answer. And I think it's also encouraging the working together. I think we need to come to a new place. Look, we've had in the education debate, you'll always hear, oh, it was great when the local authorities were in charge of schools. Oh, now there are these academies. But actually, we need to be creating new local models that really bring together all services for children, including health. It needs to be underpinned with a unique identifier. I've been pushing for this for years. Why are we not using it? I turned up in Bedfordshire at a VRU and found a list of children that were not on any school roll, not on any doctor's surgery roll. We need to be talking to each other so we can ensure children are properly supported and we understand the situation. So I think there's something about data, information. It's like the stuff, actually, the power of Danny's book is to tell that story and shock with the data, like, look at this, but you didn't know it. So I think we've got a once in a generation chance with the new government. I'm completely independent, but I'm absolutely concerned when the wheel turns and there's a new government, there's a chance. We need to be pushing really hard. But what I need from government is to be making compelling arguments about why it is going to cost more, why it does need to change, not just Mr. Misery, but actually, this is worth it because we're going to do it for children. This is going to save our country and save our kids. So I think there's I want to see some vision as well.
Thanks, Rachel. That leads me neatly onto a question for Danny, actually, around data, which is what data you wish you had access to be able to extend the analysis. I suppose this is partly around the nature and the scale of inequality and poverty, but perhaps also around some of its consequences.
Okay, there are some particular things that are missing. We still don't know, give or take 100, 200, 300, 400,000, how many children have a parent in prison. We just don't care. I have a section on that in the book, and how the estimate doubled recently. And that really matters. Of course, the children often don't know themselves because they're told dad's gone away on holiday. So you can't ask children, but it affects the height data. Height's a really simple measure. And it reflects when it changes nutrition and how well your society is doing. We tend to get taller. We haven't yet got to our maximum heights. The fact that the height data is not released in England, and the Department of Health says when they're asked by a Freedom of Information request, oh, we won't release it because we intend to publish it in future. I mean, this is disingenuous. Scotland releases theirs, and children in Scotland are still getting taller every year. Children in England, they have to be because we know the UK figure, and we know Wales and Northern Ireland aren't very big, children in England are getting more and more stunted. And how simple do we have to make it? And who on earth thinks it's a good idea to hide this information? And I could, cynically, I could understand why Secretaries of State for Health in the years 2010 all the way through to 2024 didn't want to release this data, but we have a new government. So please just open up the books and show us the simplest thing of our children's heights and tell us what you are going to do so that next year the children of the same ages are not shorter than the year before. And what staggers me about this is I can remember elections when we used to argue about a child's ear. I think it was Jennifer's ear. I've forgotten exactly who. I'm old. Gordon Brown argued about the spending and some child having a poorly ear. This January, the debate in the newspapers, I think Georgia may have covered this, was a small boy who starved to death next to the dead body of his father. And it hit the headlines in the Sun and so on, and then kind of went a bit quiet after a few weeks, after it turned out it happened in Skegness. The national child mortality data shows us another 80 increase, like that. So it's tragic that we're using Victorian measures now to talk about the situation we're in, and we should be prepared to not be civil about people who say we cannot afford to do the most basic and decent thing that almost every other country in this continent does, right? We just need an intolerance of that kind of attitude, and I think we've reached that point.
Thank you, Danny. I was going to go around the panel with a brief question for each of you, but I think we haven't got time, so I think we might wrap up on that note. So thank you very much to Danny, Georgia, and Rachel for today's discussion. I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer all your questions. There was a huge amount of interest. We will be posting a recording and summary of this discussion on our website and email channels. Thank you all for coming. And thanks also to Bobby Duffy, Sophia, and the team at King's College London, the Policy Institute. Please keep an eye on our website and our email list for future events. Goodbye.
Thank you.